thank you very much, Alicia. Thank you, all of you, for having me here today. And I'm just really thrilled to be a part of your group's learning and to experience your group a little bit. I said to Becky at I think our last meeting, maybe I'll have to join. Or did you say that, Becky? Maybe you wanted my money. I'm not sure. But
I was recruiting everyone.
Yeah, she was recruiting.
Good job. We need new members.
So I will share my screen now and we will get started. I want to talk on mentorship for inclusion and belonging. I tend to, as an interculturalist, focus a little bit more on the I of DEI, but it is, to me, all three are important, but the inclusion is the one that we can all really, really engage in and have a role to play. So I'm going to talk to you about mentorship and how mentorship can lead to a greater sense of inclusion and belonging in our workplaces and in our lives. And you know what? I'm not going to talk so much about that as my TED Talk speaker. I think it's always good to get a TED Talk speaker in. They are often more engaging than I can be and challenging, although I could be challenging. But in order to appreciate, I think, the full value of what you all would bring to a mentorship relationship and to help you think about inclusion and belonging, I'm going to start with just a little bit about culture, very brief, very painless. Then we'll watch the TED Talk that is entitled, "What Does My Headscarf Mean to You?" It's about 14 minutes. And then for the remainder of the time, you'll have a chance to talk with one another in small groups. And then we will bring it back to the large group for any sort of sharing of insight, of questions, of just general comments about your discussion with each other, about the TED Talk, about intercultural generally. Before we start, I want to emphasize just a few points that I hope will mean that we create a really respectful space. I have no doubt that I'm very impressed with your space so far. You're engaged. I love that I didn't have to do the land acknowledgement, and that you're just really all seem to be thinking about topics of DEI, and that is quite heartwarming. But in order to create a respectful space, I sometimes find intercultural things people can feel a little about them, and some are more comfortable sharing, some are a little less comfortable. But the first thing I think that we need to acknowledge is we all have bias. We're human beings. It's natural. Our experiences mean that we bring certain thoughts, expectations, views to every interaction we have. Bias is not a bad thing so long as we control it and don't let it control us. The second thing I want to mention is that we all trust in each other's positive intentions. If you hear something that doesn't sit right with you, use it as an opportunity to understand the other person better and to learn from and expand each other's perspectives. That's how we grow to be more interculturally sensitive, competent, however you want to call it. Finally, we all represent cultural difference here in this group. We all have a culture, and we have so much to learn from each other if we're looking for and acknowledging all the difference around us. Difference is everywhere. That's why I call my business Difference Matters. It's everywhere and it matters. So hopefully you'll be able to learn from each other as much as you learn from me. I always come out of a workshop like this having learned an immense amount. I'm not necessarily the expert. I maybe have more to say about things, but you all have something to contribute. So just very briefly about mentorship. I want you to think for a minute. Imagine the possibilities. Mentorship, you have the opportunity to share your experiences, your expertise, your what you have learned so far in life. You have that opportunity to share with someone who has a place to go, is going someplace, where you possibly have been, but maybe someplace you haven't been, but you can still help along the way with that journey. I think mentorship should be a two-way relationship. And it should encourage growth on both the mentors and the mentees' part. I think the biggest thing that I've come to learn, and I came to learn it first from this TED Talk, is that mentorship has the opportunity for doors to open. And I hope this TED Talk will make you realize you didn't even know there were doors to open, that you could open. There are people that can't get anywhere near the door, and you can help with that. First, though, so that you kind of start to think about what doors you can open and what your own differences are, I want to talk about culture just for a minute. So just stop and think about your own culture. So often I find when I was doing a lot of student trainings, Canadian students would say, oh, we don't have culture. And all of the international students in the room would go, really? Sometimes we don't realize, but we are all, and I think I've already said it once, and I will say it again, we're all part of the diversity. And we need to recognize our part in that diversity, I think, to truly appreciate the diversity of others and to actually to interact effectively with that diversity so that you do have inclusion and you do get belonging. Belonging is the other side of inclusion. I can be as inclusive as I want, but if what I do doesn't make the other person belong or feel belonging, my inclusion isn't really that effective. Got to have those both sides. So I want you to think about your culture just for a minute. Think about your perceptions, your values, your beliefs. Think about sort of your everyday actions that might reveal some of those. If you're in the grocery store, do you go to the self-checkout as an opportunity for you to take charge, get out of the grocery store quickly? Or do you look at those self-checkouts and think they're taking away jobs from people who need them? Maybe in your work, you appreciate everything that all of the people bring to a team project. Or maybe you'd prefer to kind of do things on your own and get the job done, depending on yourself. So think about it. Your perceptions, your values, your beliefs. Now think about the groups that you belong to. I think of culture as a multitude of groups. You have so many groups that you kind of go in and out of, but with each one you have a different set of probably values, beliefs, behaviors. And that's why there is so much difference around us. It's not just about the visible difference, not just about ethnicity or race or religion. Those things that we can sometimes, we see and we can, decide that people are from certain groups. It's about so much more. I'm a wife. I identify as a woman. I am an introvert. That one has a lot of specific behaviors. I'm a sister, I'm Catholic. I'm a Queen's employee. Queen's has some culture. I'm not sure if as Kingstonians you know that, but Queen's does have a culture. I'm a cyclist. I'm a pet owner. My dog is here underneath my desk, and almost every day for the last 2 years, he has been there. And that's an important part of who I am. What groups do you belong to? What are your groups? Those groups will definitely get you thinking about the doors that you can open. Now, think about how these groups have changed, how you have changed. Are you the same person today as you were 10 years ago? 5 years ago? Think about what has caused those changes. Culture is quite dynamic. Our own cultures are dynamic and it changes. And now think about your emotions and what evokes them. And how you show them. Are you an open book? Are your emotions written all over your face and everyone can tell what you're feeling at any given moment? Or are you more restrained? Do you keep those in just because that's what feels natural? Because emotion is quite sort of deep within us, and how we express it is deep within us. Except maybe laughter. Laughter may be one emotion that most people will be quite expressive about. Okay. You may not have realized, but we just deconstructed your culture. Judith Martin and Thomas Nakayama are two interculturalists who've worked in the field of business. And business, I think quite encouragingly, is one of the places where most study of culture has been done. I think business recognizes that need to interact effectively with difference. Because we don't get very far these days without thinking globally and thinking about different markets, different ways of doing business. But I digress. Martin and Nakayama, they say, we define culture as the learned patterns of perception, values, and behaviors shared by a group of people that are dynamic and heterogeneous. Culture also involves our emotions and feelings. And I like to do that little lead up to this definition, which I find a fairly solid definition. There's billions out there. So that, we could read that definition and it wouldn't really force us to think about what it means to us, how it pertains to our cultures. But hopefully now you're realizing it does. You have perceptions, values, behaviors, you have groups, you've changed, you have emotions. The only thing that I would change there, I always did think that culture is learned. We're born a certain way and then we start learning our culture. And I thought that until I was doing some training for an Indigenous colleague at Queen's who had, when I was talking about this definition and the learning, she kind of twitched. And I finished and I said to her, I feel like you have something to say. And she said to me, well, the only thing I might question is whether for all cultures it's learned. She said most Indigenous cultures of the world have something they call ancestral memory. And that's culture that you're born with. And that was just like, so like I say, I learn something every time I give a workshop, and that was a really profound learning for me. So I would just maybe the patterns of perception, values, and behaviors, I'd say. But otherwise, it's a pretty good solid definition. So now that you're thinking about your difference, your groups, your culture, I want to move on to a TED Talk. And hopefully you'll be watching this with a slightly different kind of, slightly different thoughts in your mind and perceptions around what Yasmin Abdul Magrid has to say. So what does my headscarf mean to you? I will start it, and if I can see your face, Becky, if you can't hear or if there's any problem, can you let me know?
someone who looks like me walks past you in the street, do you think they're a mother, a refugee, or a victim of oppression? Or do you think they're a cardiologist, a barrister, or maybe your local politician? Do you look me up and down, wondering how hot I must get, or if my husband has forced me to wear this outfit? What if I wore my scarf like this? I can walk down the street in the exact same outfit, and what the world expects of me and the way I'm treated depends on the arrangement of this piece of cloth. But this isn't going to be another monologue about the hijab, because Lord knows Muslim women are so much more than the piece of cloth they choose to wrap or not wrap their head in. This is about looking beyond your bias. What if I'd walked past you and later on you'd found out that actually I was a race car engineer and that I designed my own race car and I ran my university's race team? Because it's true. What if I told you that I was actually trained as a boxer for 5 years? Because that's true too. Would it surprise you? Why? Ladies and gentlemen, ultimately that surprise and the behaviors associated with it are the product of something called unconscious bias or implicit prejudice. And that results in the ridiculously detrimental lack of diversity in our workforce, particularly in areas of influence. Hello, Australian Federal Cabinet. Let me just set something out from the outset, right? Unconscious bias is not the same as conscious discrimination. I'm not saying that in all of you there's a secret sexist or racist or urgist like lurking within waiting to get out, right? That's not what I'm saying. We all have our biases. They're the filters through which we see the world around us, right? I'm not accusing anyone. Bias is not an accusation. Rather, it's something that has to be identified, acknowledged, and mitigated against. Bias can be about race, it can be about gender, it can also be about class, education, disability. The fact is we all have biases against what's different to our social norms. The thing is, if we want to live in a world where the circumstances of your birth do not dictate your future, and where equal opportunity is ubiquitous, then each and every one of us has a role to play in making sure unconscious bias does not determine our lives. There's this really famous experiment in the space of unconscious bias, and that's in the space of gender, in the 1970s and 1980s. So orchestras back in the day were made up mostly of dudes. There was up to only 5% were female, and apparently that was because men played it differently, presumably better. Presumably. But in 1952, the Boston Symphony Orchestra started an experiment. They started blind auditions. So rather than face-to-face auditions, you would have to play behind a screen. Now, funnily enough, right, no immediate change was registered until they asked the auditioners to take their shoes off before they entered the room. Because the clickety-clack of the heels against the hardwood floors was enough to give their ladies away. Now, get this. The results of the audition showed that there was a 50% increased chance a woman would progress past the preliminary stage, and it almost tripled their chances of getting in. What does that tell us? Well, unfortunately for the guys, men actually didn't play differently, but there was the perception that they did. And it was that bias that was determining their outcome. So what we're doing here is identifying and acknowledging that a bias exists. And look, we all do it, right? Let me give you an example. A son and his father are in a horrible car accident, right? The father dies on impact, and the son who's severely injured is rushed to hospital. The surgeon looks at the son when they arrive and is like, I can't operate. Why? The boy is my son. How can that be? Ladies and gentlemen, the surgeon is his mother. Now, hands up, and it's okay, but hands up if you initially assumed the surgeon was a guy. There's evidence that that unconscious bias exists, but we all just have to acknowledge that it's there and then look at ways that we can move past it so that we can look at solutions. Now, one of the interesting things around the space of unconscious bias is the topic of quotas, and this is something that's often brought up. And one of the criticisms is this idea of merit. Look, I don't want to be picked, because I'm a chick, right? I want to be picked because I have merit, because I'm the best person for the job. It's a sentiment that's pretty common among female engineers that I work with and that I know. And yeah, I get it, I've been there. But if the merit idea was true, why would identical resumes, in an experiment done in 2012 by Yale, identical resumes sent out for a lab technician, why would Jennifer be deemed less competent, be less likely to be offered the job, and be paid less than John's? The unconscious bias is there, but we just have to look at how we can move past it. And, you know, it's interesting. There's some research that talks about why this is the case, and it's called the merit paradox, right? And in organizations, and this is kind of ironic, in organizations that talk about merit being their primary value driver in terms of who they hire, they were more likely to hire dudes and more likely to pay the guys more, because apparently merit is a masculine quality. But hey. All right, so you guys think you've got a good read on me. You kind of think you know what's up. Can you imagine me running one of these? Can you imagine me walking and be like, hey boys, this is what's up, this is how it's done? Well, I'm glad you can. Because ladies and gentlemen, that's my day job. And the cool thing about it is that it's pretty entertaining. Actually, in places like Malaysia, Muslim women on rigs isn't even comment-worthy. There are that many of them. But it is entertaining. I remember when I was telling one of the guys, hey mate, look, I really want to learn how to surf, right? And he's like, Yasmin, I don't know how you can surf with all that gear you got on. And I don't know any women-only beaches. And then the guy came up with a brilliant idea. He was like, I know, you run that organization, Youth Without Borders, right? Why don't you start like a clothing line for like Muslim chicks in beaches? You can call it Youth Without Board Shorts. And I was like, thanks, Gaz. And then I remember another bloke telling me that I should eat all the yogurt I could, because that was the only culture I was going to get around there. Right? But the problem is, it's kind of true, because there's an intense lack of diversity in our workforce, particularly in places of influence. Now, in 2010, the Australian National University did an experiment where they sent out 4,000 identical applications, right, to entry-level jobs, essentially. To get the same number of interviews as someone with an Anglo-Saxon name, if you were Chinese, you had to send out 68% more applications. If you were Middle Eastern, Abdul Majid, you have to send out 64%. And if you're Italian, you're pretty lucky. You only have to send out 12% more. In places like Silicon Valley, it's not that much better, right? In Google, they put out some diversity results, and 61% white, 30% Asian, and a bunch of blacks, Hispanics, all that kind of thing. And the rest of the tech world is not that much better, and they've acknowledged it, but I'm not really sure what they're doing about it. And the thing is, it doesn't trickle up. In a study done by Green Park, who are a British sort of senior exec supplier, they said that over half of the FTSE 100 companies don't have a non-white leader at their board level, executive or non-executive, and 2 out of every 3 don't have an executive who's from a minority. And most of the minorities that are at that sort of level are non-executive board directors, so their influence isn't that great. But hey, look, I mean, I've told you a bunch of terrible things, and you're like, oh my God, how bad is that? What can I do about it? Well, fortunately, we've identified that there's a problem. There's a lack of opportunity, and that's due to unconscious bias. But you might be sitting there thinking, well, I ain't brown. What's that got to do with me? Let me offer you a solution. And as I said before, we live in a world where we're looking for an ideal. And if we want to create a world where the circumstances of your birth don't matter, we all have to be part of the solution. And interestingly, the author of the lab resume experiment offered some sort of a solution. She said the one thing that brought the successful women together, the one thing they had in common, was the fact that they had good mentors. So mentoring, we've all kind of heard that before. It's in the vernacular. Here's another challenge for you. I challenge each and every one of you to mentor someone different. Think about it, right? Everyone wants to mentor someone who kind of is familiar, who looks like us, we have shared experiences. If I see a Muslim chick who's got a bit of attitude, I'm like, what's up? We can hang out, right? You walk into a room and there's someone who went to the same school, you play the same sports, there's a high chance that you're gonna wanna help that person out. But for the person in the room who has no shared experiences with you, it becomes extremely difficult to find that connection. So the idea of finding someone different to mentor, someone who doesn't come from the same background as you, whatever that background is about opening doors for people who couldn't even get to the damn hallway. Because ladies and gentlemen, the world is not just. People are not born with equal opportunity. I was born in one of the poorest cities in the world, Khartoum. I was born brown, I was born female, and I was born Muslim in a world that is pretty suspicious for reasons I can't control. However, I also acknowledge the fact that I was born with privilege. I was born with amazing parents, I was given an education and had the blessing of migrating to Australia, but also I've been blessed with amazing mentors who have opened doors for me that I didn't even know were there. A mentor who said to me, hey, your story is interesting, let's write something about it so that I can share it with people. A mentor who said, I know you're all the things that don't belong on an Australian rig, but come on anyway. And here I am talking to you. And I'm not the only one. There's all sorts of people in my communities that I see have been helped out by mentors. A young Muslim man in Sydney who ended up using his mentor's help to start up a poetry slam in Bankstown, and now it's a huge thing, and he's able to change the lives of so many other young people. Or a lady here in Brisbane, an Afghani lady who's a refugee, could barely speak English when she came to Australia. Her mentors helped her become a doctor, and she took out Young Queenslander of the Year in 2008. She's an inspiration, right? This is so not smooth. Anyway. This is me, right? But I'm also the woman in the rig clothes, and I'm also the woman that was in the ibaya at the beginning. Would you have chosen to mentor me if you'd seen me in one of those other versions of who I am? Because I'm that same person. We have to look past our unconscious bias. Find someone to mentor who's at the opposite end of your spectrum, because structural change takes time, and I don't have that level of patience, okay? So if we're going to create a change, if we're going to create a world where we all have those kind of opportunities, then choose to open doors for people. Because you might think that diversity has nothing to do with you, but we are all part of the system and we can all be part of that solution. And if you don't know where to find someone different, go to the places you wouldn't usually go. If you enroll in private high school tutoring, go to your local state school, or maybe just drop into your local refugee tutoring center. Or perhaps you work at an office. Take out that new grad who looks totally out of place, because that was me, and open doors for them, not in a tokenistic way, because we're not victims, but show them the opportunities, because opening up your world will make you realize that you have access to doors they didn't even know existed, and you didn't even know they didn't have. Ladies and gentlemen, there is a problem in our community with lack of opportunity, especially due to unconscious bias, but each and every one of you has the potential to change that. And I know you've been given a lot of challenges today, but if you can take this one piece and think about it a little differently, because diversity is magic, right? And I encourage you to look past your initial perceptions, because I bet you they're probably wrong. Thank you.
Okay. So now comes the small group discussion part of today. So Matt, I think you are working on the small groups. Each of the groups will have a member of your DEI committee, I believe. And I want you to think about, discuss various cultural groups or identities that you could mentor because you're different. Where you can find mentorship opportunities to mentor someone different from yourself. But also what obstacles you might encounter if mentoring someone who is different. What skills or characteristics might help you overcome these obstacles?